Hi, good afternoon. I'm Danny. I know you got a bit of an introduction about me there from Daniel. It'll be weird talking at my computer and just imagining that people are out there, but yeah, feel free to drop questions in either the chat box or the questions box, and I'll try and keep up with them as they come in, but I'll probably get to most of the questions at the end. And I'm going to try and keep my talking to less than 45 minutes, so there's more time at the end. Also, because you guys have been like in online presentations for a couple hours now, I'm assuming, and they can get kind of tiring to listen to one person talk for so long. So yeah, I'm Danny. I work with the charity Community Forests International. Our organization started in 2008 when two tree planters saw the need for an organization that helps foster strong connections between people and forests, as this is where we feel the most important climate solutions can be found. So we have 3 offices. One is in Sackville, New Brunswick, where myself and my 6 coworkers are based, and 2 of our offices are in Zanzibar, which is an archipelago off the coast of Tanzania. Our Canada work focuses on climate change mitigation, and our Tanzania work focuses on climate change adaptation. I'm sure most of you know what the difference is between these 2 types of climate work, but there might be a wide range of participants, so I'll just give a bit of an explanation. Mitigation work essentially tries to stop and hopefully reverse climate change, whereas adaptation happens in areas where the impacts of climate change are already being felt. So those living in these areas must adapt their lives and make changes. And unfortunately, the drivers of climate change happen mostly in first world countries like Canada, which is why our mitigation work happens here. And then adaptation work typically happens in poorer regions of the world, like Tanzania, where these populations of people are not the causes of climate change, but they're feeling more of the impacts of it right now. So I'll start with a short description of the adaptation work in Tanzania. It's a smaller portion of this presentation, and I'll go more in depth into our Canada work, since that's where all of my work is focused, and I don't know too much about our Tanzania work, unfortunately, but I can give a brief overview. Climate change is already being felt around the world in vulnerable locations, like I mentioned, and this group of islands off Tanzania is one of the most vulnerable populations of people in terms of climate change. They're experiencing droughts followed by storms and heavy rainfalls, and a climate that is changing more quickly than the natural ecosystems can adapt. So they have to adapt to climate change. And as I mentioned, we have 2 teams there, and they're teams of locals who work within their communities to develop a climate adapted way of life. So our work there has been ongoing for 11 years, and in those 11 years, we've planted over 2.5 million trees on remote islands in Zanzibar to help the region better adapt to climate change. And our other ongoing work there includes establishing community-owned nurseries to restore forests and mangrove forests for climate change adaptation. We work to train women and farmers to grow permaculture kitchen gardens for food security and for economic independence. And we work in growing regenerative agroforests and developing business and international trade skills. So like I mentioned, the work that we do there is all based on locals in the community. So really it's just kind of, we are funneling funds to allow them to do this work that they already know how to do. And you can read more about our Zanzibar work on our website, and I'm going to drop in the chat box right now. Okay. So now about our Canada work. which is what the rest of the presentation will cover. Our work focuses on this ecoregion on the map, which has many names, such as the Mi'kmaq name of Wabanaki Forest, but I'll refer to it as the Acadian Forest for this presentation. Our work focuses on the 3 maritime provinces, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, where the Acadian Forest is found in Canada. The state of the Acadian Forest here has been dramatically altered due to intensive industrial forest management practices. Most of the forest you see when you drive along the road or hike in your local woods is not what the forest once was. Unfortunately, the natural Acadian forest is a beautiful mix of both conifers, such as spruce and pine, and deciduous hardwoods like maples and oaks and birches. And most of what's there now is young, it's not very diverse, and it's mostly softwood stands. And this is because when a forest is cut, it can take up to 100 years for it to go through its natural regeneration phases to reach its original diversity of species and diversity of age to what it once was before it was cut. And unfortunately, over 99% of the Acadian forest has been cut at some point through history. So this means that there's less than 1% of old growth Acadian forest left in the Maritimes, which is pretty sad to say the least. It's pretty hard to believe that there's that little old growth left. Yeah, and forestry in the Maritimes is stuck in this negative feedback loop, which I'm sure most of us already know, where our industry depends on softwood trees for pulp and slab wood. So this means that as our forests try to grow back after being cut, most of what's actively managed is managed for softwood species. And this is not the natural forest composition that's found here. So how do we change that? How do we get out of this negative feedback loop? What can we do to bring back the natural Acadian forest? And like, why is it important to bring back the Acadian forest? Like, why do we need that kind of forest composition? So we need the natural Acadian forest to help mitigate climate change, essentially. The Acadian forest has the capacity to hold a full year's worth of Canada's carbon emissions. A full year, that's a lot of carbon, especially considering Canada is one of the worst emitters in the world, in large part due to the tar sands. So the Acadian forest can play a huge role in our mitigation efforts in Canada. And that's because the forest composition in the Acadian forest is very unique. It's where the boreal forest of the north meets the hardwood forests to the south. So we have an extremely diverse forest that naturally has a very low risk of forest fire. So this means that as our forests grow and function, they have a huge capacity to store and draw down carbon from the atmosphere, both above and below the soil, because it's not just trees, but healthy soils that store huge amounts of carbon. And I'm sure we all know climate change is caused by pollutants in the air, one of the worst ones being CO2, and this just happens to be what trees breathe in. So this is what will slow and hopefully reverse climate change. So that's why it's important to restore our forests back to normal. But how do we do that? So in order to go about a forestry paradigm change, it's important to understand land ownership and management in the Maritimes. So this slide focuses on New Brunswick, but it's very similar in the rest of the Maritimes. So about half of the province is owned by the provincial and federal governments. 22% is industrially owned in New Brunswick, and the remaining 26% is owned by small private landowners. And many organizations do work involving public and industrial land, but we work closely with small private landowners. And this dynamic that we have here is super unique in the Maritimes, that we have so much of our land owned by so many individuals. It's not like this in the rest of Canada. And we believe like this unique dynamic is the key to creating that paradigm shift necessary for Acadian forest restoration. However, just in New Brunswick, there's about 40,000 small private woodlot owners, and in the whole of the Maritimes, there's about 82,000. That's a lot of people to connect with and try to get to work together. but it's something that's necessary and something that we're making strides toward. And it's important to note that in the Maritimes, none of the land here has been ceded by Indigenous peoples in friendship treaties in the maritime regions. So that's a very important factor at play with land ownership ideas. So some information on the woodlot owners themselves. Most of them are over 60, most of them are male or a couple, and most of them are rural. And a lot of woodlot owners are financially insecure and are approaching or have already reached retirement. These factors combined leads to the threat of them clear cutting their land, especially since most woodlot owners don't have a plan for who will take the woodlots over after them. Unfortunately, not many younger people are as interested in inheriting a forest that they have to manage. And that's a common trend that you can see in other industries, such as farming. Succession planning is a big issue for certain times. So woodlots in the Maritimes typically range in size from 30 to 300 acres, but of course there's people who own larger forests. Many woodlots have quite a history of use and a lot of cutting, but not many have a good history of management plans. It's not super common that someone will have implemented a management plan many years ago and have followed it as accurately as they could. So yeah, in recent years, market access for small private woodlot owners has diminished because of small mills closing down and bigger companies having a monopoly on production and harvesting and processing of harvested wood. So clear cutting has unfortunately become the new norm for most woodlot owners, as they're faced with few to no other options, really. Okay, so in addition to the threat of poor forest management, the Acadian forest faces a changing climate as well. So generally, the climate in the Maritimes is becoming warmer and wetter, with higher peaks and lows in terms of rainfall. As we've been noticing in the recent years, we won't get rain for weeks, and then suddenly we'll get a huge downpour followed by another drought. And we've also seen an increase in extreme storm events, which leads to flooding. And flooding is felt especially strongly in the Maritimes. Unfortunately, the current state of our forests can't slow and retain floodwater as they could if they were healthy and in a natural state. So this has caused New Brunswick to access disaster relief funds more in the last 10 years than any other province or territory. So the effects of climate change have to be taken into account as we plan for the restoration of our forest. We have changing temperatures, we have changing rainfall cycles. We need to plan ahead for this in terms of species composition and diversity. So as an overview so far, our mission, Community Forest International, is to fight climate change by empowering rural communities to thrive with nature, be that here in the Maritimes or across the world in Tanzania. The challenge is that our rural people are poor, our environment is degraded, and our landowners are forced to make decisions that make climate change worse and not better. So how do we fix that? So I'm going to cover 4 categories of our projects, 4 different paths to success that we've come up with to help try and solve the problems that I've outlined so far. So the first project is our New Forests, or our Adopt a Clear Cut program. This project of ours essentially creates new forests with natural Acadian forest species that are climate adaptive, that live a long time, and that store a lot of carbon. So for that, we buy clear-cut land to take it out of the industrial forestry cycle, and then we replant it with native tree species. Most of the tree planting operations in Canada are unfortunately planting future clear cuts. They're all within the same industrial system. So we try to plant better with the future in mind. We plant species like red maple, sugar maple, hemlock, white pine, red spruce, and kind of any other climate adaptive trees that we can manage to find in local nurseries. And the land that we replant will grow to be a natural Acadian forest. And we put a working lands conservation easement on our new forest as well. So that means that for the next at least 100 years, the forest can't be destroyed or clear cut. We do some light management as the forest to ensure the hardwoods that we planted have enough space to grow and don't get crowded out or shaded out from competing natural regeneration. And to date, as you can see on the screen, we have planted a total of 550,000 trees in the Maritimes. Most of those are on the Chignecto Isthmus. And we've conserved 910 acres of new forests. And as these forests grow, they'll draw down carbon and they'll become massive carbon stores in the future. So the second program we'll talk about is our Old Forest program. So in addition to creating and conserving new forests, we're always on the hunt for old forests to protect. So we currently have 1,174 acres of old forest conserved, and this forest holds more than 30,000 tons of elemental CO2. We manage these forests lightly to increase the amount of carbon they store and to ensure they adapt with climate change. So these forests too, like our new forests, have working lands conservation easements on them, which allows us to do this light management for carbon while also preserving the forest for at least 100 years. And the forests that we look to conserve, that 1,174 acres, we look for forests that's at least 80 years old, so that would classify it as mature forest standards, with a good diversity of long-lived hardwoods and softwoods, and with little to no cutting in recent years. Where am I here? Okay. Yeah, these forests come to us either by straight out purchasing them or by donation. So there are 3 forests that we own, like 3 major parcels, which we've named after the people who owned them before us, because these people have had a really strong connection to the forest that they basically grew up with and grew up in. So we named the 3 forests Welgenbrand, which is a combination of like 5 different names of the previous owners, the Robinson Forest, and the Buchanan Forest. So I'm going to talk about Welgenbrand as a bit of a case study. So this is a map of Welgenbrand, which is just east of Sussex, New Brunswick. You can see, unfortunately, in the upper section, there's been a lot of clear cutting surrounding this forest, which is super unfortunate. We tried to purchase those lands while they were still forested, but yeah, because they were like Welgenbrand, like beautiful mature forest, but unfortunately they were owned by a logging company and there was no chance that they were going to sell or donate them to us. So as a second best option, we purchased the land after it was cut, and now it's part of our adopted clear cut program that I just described. And these new forests were just planted a few weeks ago, actually, by our crew of tree planters. Yeah, those clear cuts that you can see caused a lot of flooding on our property, because our property is just downhill from it. This didn't come as a big surprise to us, knowing the science behind forests and how they act as a natural infrastructure against flooding. The fact that those forests have been removed obviously means flooding downstream. And there's a little brook that runs through our property. And after that forest uphill was cut, the brook has changed dramatically. Rainfalls now cause it to flood, and that flooding is changing the brookside ecology. And the brook has a lot more like silt and soil matter settling in it because of the lack of forest uphill. Because once those trees are removed, the soils are then exposed and they erode and they degrade during storms. So this is a photo of the homestead along the brook on the Welgan Brand property. This section of the property was an organic vegetable farm run by the previous owners before they stopped farming as they grew older. It's a really beautiful property. It's 705 acres in size, and most of that is like beautiful, mature forest. And we've built trails through different stands of the forest, and we have 2 cabins on the property where visitors can stay for free. We have a tenant living in the house, and he takes care of the buildings on the property. And yeah, this forest is open to anyone who wants to go visit and explore and walk the trails. We just ask that you email us first. So anyone attending this, like, feel free to go explore, explore this piece of forest land. So you might be wondering how we purchase these forests and where the funding comes from. And what the long-term plan is. We realize that buying up mature forests isn't a very scalable or long-term solution, and we don't plan to buy and own all of the mature forests in the Maritimes. No, so mostly this project is a prototype of a bigger idea we have. These forests were purchased by creating a carbon offsetting program. Many of you probably know what a carbon tax system is or what a cap and trade system is. But just in case anyone doesn't, I'll explain very crudely and quickly. Essentially, a carbon tax is when there's a tax that you have to pay for the pollution that you produce. And a cap and trade system is when companies have a cap or like a maximum amount of pollution that they can produce. And if they produce more than their maximum amount, they have to pay heavy fines for that extra pollution, or they trade that amount with other groups or companies that produce less pollution and they are below their cap, or they have to offset their extra pollution in some way. So both of these systems aim to reduce the amount of pollution and therefore reduce climate change. So currently there's no forest or compliance markets in Canada. This is hopefully changing soon. The federal government is coming up with a plan for a compliance market and reaching out to different organizations in Canada for input right now. And we're hoping this will be a thing at some point. It was supposed to happen this fall, but of course it's being pushed back for somewhat understandable reasons. We are in a pandemic and there's a little bit focus shift with the government right now, but hopefully it'll happen at some point. So because there's no forest market or there's no compliance market that people have to adhere to, we created the first voluntary market east of British Columbia in Canada. So we have clients that choose to offset their carbon emissions by paying us to conserve enough forest land that stores an amount of carbon equal to the amount that they have emitted. So essentially, these companies join our voluntary market to offset their own pollution. Yeah, and this is how we've been able to conserve the nearly 1,200 acres that we own, is through this voluntary market. And we have more contracts to fulfill currently, so we're on the hunt for mature forests to purchase or ideally have donated to us. So if anyone listening has forest land that they want to sell, or if they know of anyone who has mature forest, please reach out to me. My email should be listed there, but I'll send it in the chat as well. Yeah, and like I said, this project so far has been a prototype to work out the kinks of this voluntary market. And now that we have kind of a system in place, we're hoping to scale it up and disseminate that to landowners in the Maritimes, and so everyone's ready for the federal compliance market whenever it comes into place. So this is a good visualization of the process we've worked out for the voluntary market. So when we find a property that seems like a good fit for this project, we first measure the stored carbon in the forest. And if the amount of carbon is above our set baseline, and our baseline is based on like typical industrial forest management, and how much carbon those stands hold, because that is the typical way land is used in the Maritimes. So that's what our baseline is based off of. So if our property that we're looking at purchasing holds more carbon than that baseline amount, then we move forward with purchasing the property. Once the property is ours, we install a conservation easement to ensure it can't be cut for the next 100 years. No matter if it leaves our hands or not, that conservation easement is tied to that land. And then next, we get the property certified under the FSC certification or the Forest Stewardship Council certification. And as years go by, we monitor and manage the carbon stored in that forest to increase over the years, increase the amount of carbon that is stored in that stand. Because this is a voluntary market that we've created, there's no set of guidelines that we have to follow. So instead, we hold ourselves to Vera's improved forest management protocol. And I've kind of described it already, but essentially that outline, that protocol says that we need to increase the amount of carbon over time, and we need to hold that initial amount of carbon at least for 100 years, and hold ourselves to severe penalties for reversals of this commitment. And all of that is taken care of in our contracts with our clients. And yeah, the big challenge with this prototype of the voluntary market in shifting it to the future compliance market is that it's hard to aggregate small woodlots to make them ready for the federal carbon program. There's a large cost and a lot of paperwork involved in being approved for these programs. And so it only makes sense for parcels of land that are around 5,000 to 10,000 acres in size. Unfortunately, if someone owns like a 200-acre woodlot, it doesn't make sense for them to pay to be included in the compliance market. They won't get that money back, essentially, with the amount of carbon that they hold. So aggregating to parcels of around 5,000 to 10,000 acres in size is a lot of work, but it's the only way that it makes sense. So this means that like large groups of private woodlot owners are going to have to aggregate their lands together to make it worthwhile to apply. But this provides woodlot owners with another source of income from their land aside from clear cutting. So it's definitely worth the efforts of aggregation, especially for those people who don't want to see their forest clear cut for like a very small amount of money. We currently have a group of 10 landowners who collectively own about 6,000 acres. And they're ready and waiting for the federal program to materialize so they can take advantage of it and not have to clear cut their forests and still earn an income off their land. So finally, the last program I'll talk about is our knowledge and tool building. All of this information and tools and practices that we know about, it's all great, but it's only helpful if it effectively reaches the landowners themselves. So disseminating that information and making it digestible and accessible to those who need it is very important. That's the only way we'll actually make a difference, is if the landowners themselves have access to different ways of managing our forest, and why it's important to manage in a different way. So we have at least 8 collaborative projects on the go to develop skills, tools, research, and methodology around climate-smart forestry practices. And we're partnering with about 12 organizations in the Maritimes, organizations like the marketing boards in New Brunswick and woodlot owner associations in Nova Scotia, to help ensure that we reach as many landowners as possible with this information. Yeah. And that brings me to the end. That was whizzed right through that real quick. Yeah, I welcome any questions at this point. I'll check the questions tab here. Okay. If I'm a small woodlot owner and I don't have the expertise or time to well manage my forest, where can I get Acadian forest management friendly service? That's a good question. There are different businesses and organizations that do this. One of our old employees, he actually branched off to create his own company, Dale Prest. He started a company that helps with managing for carbon on your land, and creating forest management plans. I don't remember the name of his organization right now. Dale, but yeah, Dale Prest. I can find his email and send that along. But yeah, there are organizations out there that do that, and I'll get you to send me an email, Alexi, and I can connect you with Dale. So I'm going to put it. Okay. Okay, another question from Pamela. Pre-COVID, we had a mini Acadian forest, started in 7 hydroponics towers. Such a shame to see the project fail. Have you done anything like this? No, I've never. No, I've never heard of anything like that. Yeah, I've never even heard of anything like that. Is that growing? I know you guys can't speak back to me, which is unfortunate right here, but is that growing Acadian forest species in like hydroponically? Yeah, I'm a little bit confused about what that is. Okay, I'll move on to another question here. Okay, Peter Thomas. It's anticipated that in 80 to 100 years, we'll have a climate in New Brunswick that will be more suited to an oak hickory forest. So do I see that as accurate? And is your organization planning that far out with regard to experimental clear-cut replanting regimes in this part of the world? Yes, exactly. That's exactly what we're doing. So we manage, that is accurate. As the climate changes, we're going to be seeing a more hardwood dominated forest, similar to what we see south of us right now. And we manage for that, which is fortunate because those trees, hardwood trees, they store more carbon, and they live longer than a lot of the kind of like boreal forest species that we have in our mix at the Acadian forest. So when we do our planting, we do focus mostly on tree species that are found in forests a little further south, and that can withstand longer periods without rain, and that can stand warmer temperatures. Yeah, so we don't do experimental clear-cut replanting. Yes, so we are, like I said, the trees that we plant are adapted to the future climate, especially because in even 40 years, we don't expect that a lot of the softwood species that we see here won't be doing very well. Like white spruce and balsam fir, we can already see in southern Nova Scotia that they're not doing well. Balsam fir kind of like caps out at 20 or 30 years old and then dies. It just can't withstand like the warmer temperatures anymore. So we are planning for that. Alexi asked another question. Do you plan on also doing adaptation work in the Acadian forest? Because of the speed of global warming we currently experience, some species maybe won't be able to migrate north fast enough to survive. Like planting trees with more southern attributes more up north. Yeah, exactly. Like I just kind of answered that in the previous question, but that's exactly what we're doing. We're kind of like focusing more on forests as opposed to softwoods. See some comments here. There are several woodlot owner cooperatives in Nova Scotia that primarily do this type of work if you are on that side of the border. UNB, CFI, along with several others, are working with forest practitioners throughout the region to develop a network of experience dedicated to changing how we manage privately owned Acadian forests. Yeah, exactly. That's a big project that we at CFI are working with UNB and other organizations right now, is building that that capacity and information sharing between small private woodlot owners. So we have a new project calling it like the Acadian Forest Partnership, developing the Acadian Forest Accord. So kind of developing a way to get private landowners to share information and help each other and manage in a better way and create community forests that everyone can enjoy and recreate in, and have those tools and resources available online or on paper for people to very easily access anything that they need to help them manage in a better way. So that was a good thing to bring up, Craig. Okay, Michelle asked a question. So I'm on 150 acres of mixed forest in Albert County. I cut a small amount of wood to heat my home, but that's it. I plan on creating a robust habitat for wildlife, despite the 5 cords of wood I harvest per year. It would be great to talk with you on how to create a rich habitat for years to come. The additional 18 acres are river and field, which we mow once per year in late autumn. Cuttings are left to decompose in the fields. Any input on better practices would be appreciated. Michelle, feel very free to send me an email. My coworker Megan DeGraff and I, we can get back to you with better information on how you can better manage your 150 acres, or put you in touch with someone who can create a forest management plan that incorporates carbon storage and climate adaptive silviculture practices. Pamela made a comment. Kids gather seeds from the seed bank in Fredericton, and this is in, I guess, response to the hydroponics. Grow Acadian forest and create an Acadian forest museum on our campus. Kids also wanted to manipulate the environments where the hydroponic towers were placed to see which species were more resilient to a warmer environment. That is a very cool project. Wow, especially if it's like kids getting involved. That's super interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that. I'd never heard of that. Thank you for telling me about that. That's great. Yeah, if anyone has any more questions, we're not at the time yet, but.
Yeah, actually, I'll jump in with one if that's all right.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So monoculture forests in New Brunswick, many of the companies that are operating, such as some of the larger ones, are primarily planting monoculture forests in their clear-cut areas. So I'm just wondering, as climates are changing, how we can expect these forests to be impacted compared to more diverse forest stands.
Yeah, it depends on the species that is in these monocultures, but definitely any kind of monoculture crop system does not do well as a diverse forest, as a diverse system. That happens in agriculture, it happens in forestry. And as the climate continues to change, unfortunately, a lot of the monoculture stands that are being planted right now are being planted with tree species that are not going to do well as the climate changes. And that's really unfortunate that bigger companies aren't kind of adapting their methods for the changing climate. It's really, yeah, it makes sense, obviously, environmentally to have a more diverse forest, but if you expect your forest to be economically viable in 40 or 50 years when you want to cut it, you can't continue to plant these monoculture crops. It's yeah, they're not expected to do well at all, especially like, yeah, balsam fir and white spruce are very heavily planted in the Maritimes, and those two species are not expected to do well in 40 years. So a lot of those, if there's monocultures being planted of those right now, which there is a lot of, they're not expected to hold up well when the time comes to be harvesting them, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. And actually, because I don't see any more questions in the chat, I will ask one more. Can you recommend any online resources for people who are interested in learning more about what species they should be planting, particularly if they want to be proactive for our changing climate here?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not sure about any online resources. I know they're there. I can follow up with you on that. I wish I had them right in front of me so I could send them to everyone here right now, but yeah, if anyone wants to hear more about that, please send me an email. I can get resources to you as soon as I have them in front of me, because I know they're there.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Danny, for an interesting and informative presentation. It's great to learn more about Community Forest International's research and conservation endeavors here in New Brunswick. So I would also like to note that at Cape Jourimain, it's estimated that up to 90% of the original Acadian forest was cleared for lumber and agriculture in the 1800s. And so while much of it is in the process of regrowing, it's no longer as species diverse as it was prior to European settlement. So an interesting connection to your discussion about the forests in our region.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.